Is for today, everything's okay, everything's okay. Never comes again, another day like yesterday. Is for today, everything's okay, everything's okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to do one called Maximizing Your Therapy Experience, Advice and Cautions. And this one's going to be a little bit more clinical. It's just about therapy, how to get the most out of your therapy. And I think I've written before or spoken before about choosing a therapist. So I'm not going to go into that because that's a whole subject on its own, about the need for being really flexible and open to trying different therapists, even if the therapist has the right modality for you and it sounds good. If you go in and it's just a weird dynamic or you just don't feel like it's a good fit, it's important that you feel comfortable or that you feel connected at least. So, but I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to give you a set of goals or thoughts or ways of approaching therapy that can make it so much more effective. And at the very least, it saves you time and it saves you money, because therapy can get expensive pretty quickly. And I'll pull back the hood, right? Get under the hood a little bit about what it is therapists are thinking or what they're trying to offer and what makes them able to maximize their skill set and to offer a little bit more. And then let you know what are real cautions for therapists. Not that they're worried about the person or that they're worried about how the person is with them, but just there are some really strong indicators that therapy is not going to work. And you may try, but ultimately there's a real strong tendency for there to be mediocre outcomes. And it's not really important, it's not about the therapist, but meaning that then that person, right, the client who came in may feel even more resistance to ever doing therapy because the environment or the setup was not appropriate for therapy. So let's start with the goals or the intentions. I forget which modality it was, but there's a modality that really talks about where people are when they come into therapy in terms of readiness. And then there are 5 personality characteristics. Having a certain number of those makes people much more successful in therapy. Agreeableness, insight. I forget what the other ones are, but there can be things that make it very difficult to succeed in therapy and to make it difficult for a therapist to support you. Let's start with some of the more extreme ones. Really extreme personality disorders, by definition, all have a deep disconnect to the person's true emotional core, how they really feel, and to an identity that's much more aligned with how they were born and who they are. So that can be very, very difficult. That doesn't mean that someone who struggles with that shouldn't go to therapy, but what it means is, in order to be a personality disorder, you have to be almost entirely unaware of who you really are. And in most cases, you have constructed a false identity built out of trauma coping skills, compulsions, addictions, defense mechanisms like anger, abrasiveness, manipulation. And people see you as that and they say, well, that's that person's personality. You see that as that, right? That's why they're called personality disorders, because the truth is it's a construction of a false personality. And so when you come into therapy, the truth is all you're doing is handing the therapist that false personality. And you can't really do any healing work or really evolve until the therapist builds a deep, profound amount of trust, because the reason that person built that is because they have been abused so badly that they have no trust of anybody or anything. And so then the therapist has to build a deep, profound trust with the client, and then has to take almost always years to slowly gently and respectfully deconstruct the false personality built out of coping mechanisms and abrasive behaviors and defense mechanisms and trauma responses, and to help that person understand that that was never you in the first place. That's just the human animal will build this defense mechanism to protect itself, and that's not your fault. After what you experienced in your childhood, that's what you did. You built that, and it's okay to let it go. So slowly over years, that person will let go of one piece and another piece. And at some point, enough of it is let go that this desperate, starved, but also terrified inner core of emotions will come up. So then there'll be another crisis. The therapist needs to be really skilled in containing that crisis and leveraging the trust in the therapeutic environment to ease the true person in alignment with their real emotional core into the work, and then slowly start healing. So without going further into that, my guess is, most of my audience is not in that level of trauma. Some people are, and that's very difficult and whatever. And I hope you get good support if you feel that that's where you're at. But what this highlights is that people come in various stages of insight and readiness, right? So, for example, when I started therapy, I had little to no insight or understanding of what had been done to me, of the people around me. I had highly idealized the people who had abused me. I had demonized myself and idealized myself in other ways. There was a bunch of just false BS. However, at the same time, I wasn't at a level of a personality disorder of dysfunction because I desperately wanted and needed things to change. Whereas often a personality disorder will come into therapy just to talk about how other people annoy them. They're not ready to change. They want the therapist to align with them and to tell them how terrible the world is and how unfair it is, which for them, their childhood is often true. But I came in intensely motivated, right? So there's motivation and a readiness to change, but without insight about what was done to you and who people are and who you are and how to stop idealizing yourself and demonizing yourself and idealizing other people and demonizing other people. It's hard to work, but at the very first, there's just, am I aware of the need for change? And then, am I motivated to change? Am I capable of changing? Am I capable of the insight? Am I capable of directing that insight at me when that might be very, very uncomfortable? As I recognize, oh, this person that I've idealized really is just out and out abusive and has treated me terribly over the years, then you also have to own that you may have internalized some of those behaviors and you may have done that to someone. And so then as you own that they were abusive, you may have to look at yourself and go, wow, I also abused people. I also mistreated people. And struggle with shame, and instead of being shamed, go what do I want to do? How do I want to change such that I'm a better person and I have more self-awareness, et cetera, et cetera. So not to get too far into the structural clinical side of it, but essentially when people come into therapy, if they're coming into therapy, one of the cautions that therapists have that we have to look out for is this person coming in just to seek alignment with a therapist to tell the client how horrible their spouse is and how unfairly they're being treated and how they're a victim of everything, and this doesn't mean that you don't deserve empathy and sympathy, and that your therapists, depending on their modality, can and should align with you. They're in psychodynamic therapy, often they don't align with you. They just want you to sort of feel who you are and sort it out in traditional psychoanalytical therapy. So there are modalities of therapy where the therapist is going to sidestep. for myself and for a lot of deep developmental trauma therapists, we do align with the client carefully and with good boundaries because they've never had anyone back them up or advocate for them or really show real caring about what happened to them. But that doesn't mean, and so then that can be gamed, right? Or when I was an experienced therapist, sometimes I would work with clients and it would take me 6 months to realize, oh, I'm aligning and providing empathy and empathizing with the way this person has struggled, but this person isn't using that as a safe place to take responsibility. This person is just sort of infantilizing themselves, parentifying me, the therapist, and there's no change here. There's no healthy growth. That alignment is being leveraged by someone who doesn't want to look at themselves and who isn't going to look at themselves, right? So the ability to look at self and to get uncomfortable is crucial in therapy. So a therapist has a certain amount of caution when you see someone come in who isn't like, well, I see myself do this and I see myself do that, and I don't like it. I don't like how I feel in these situations. I don't like how I respond to other people. I'm ashamed of this behavior. It's like, that's a very healthy sign, because that's someone who may have been demonized as a child, right? So they may have to get over blaming themselves, which can be as stubborn, but it is a bit easier to work with if they're willing to accept responsibility and go, I want to work with myself. Like, I don't expect the world to shift and change for me. I want to work with myself, and I want to change things so that I show up better for myself and for other people. If you can't tell, I'm just sort of riffing. I didn't organize my thoughts on this. But so what this means for the client is, you don't have to. If you feel really bewildered and you're like, I don't know, when I started therapy, I had no idea. I had no idea what a goal would be, other than I don't want to feel this anxious and I don't want to be this compulsive, and I don't want to get so depressed that I feel suicidal. Obviously, like, help me stop doing that, right? It can be really helpful, and it can make for better therapeutic outcomes, and it can really help your therapist help you, support you, if you have some idea of where you're going with this. Why did you come in? Occasionally I'll talk to someone where, and this will lead to one of the bigger points, where someone will come in and they'll be like, well, people have always told me I should probably go to therapy, and I thought it would probably be pretty good. And so I've never been, but I think, it's a good idea for me. And it's like, the therapist can explore with them, and often people will get performative, right? So we have an idea of therapists as someone who has some elevated level of social dynamics and what a healthy emotional presentation and psychological presentation is. And what's really interesting is with those people is they'll often start performing to the very best of their abilities to show that they've got this skill set. That can be very confusing for the therapist, right? Because inside, for the therapist, it's like, well, I don't understand why you're here, right? I mean, it's not that the therapist wants to feel superior and be like, well, I need to know stuff that you don't know, but as you are being paid to do a job to help someone work on something. I see this happen more often with men than I do with women. Well, they'll come in and they'll be like, well, they'll theoretically acknowledge, I have issues with this and with that, and I do get anxious. Let's say, okay, I get anxious in job interviews and, blah, blah, blah. And if you attempt to tease it out and go, well, how do you experience that? And, what are your coping mechanisms? Are there things that have worked for you? Does that connect with you? Is that something that you've experienced all the way back to childhood? Is it connected to childhood experiences? I'm saying this very quickly. Obviously, there's a more gentle, sort of nurturing exploration. That client will instantly sort of go, oh, yeah, no. Like, I do this and that, and it's fine. And, actually, I'm pretty good at it. And they'll suddenly present as this enclosed system that doesn't need any help. And so the therapist is left with these conflicting messages of, I kind of have this issue. It might be why I'm here. I don't like this. And as soon as the therapist explores it to go, well, what's the anatomy of this issue? Are there ways that we can look at it? Are there ways we can think about it? Is it connected to any traumas that we want to become more aware of and take that as a starting point? The person immediately sort of closes up and goes, oh, no, I've got it all stitched up. It's fine. It's weird, right? I mean, when you hear me say it, it sounds weird, but it actually happens fairly often early in the work. And of course, it's a therapist's job to understand that and to back out and go, this person doesn't want immediate, like, let's leap in and work on this. They're feeling the situation out. There's nothing wrong with that. But what I'm saying is you as the client can get a lot more out of therapy if you've really thought about what is it that I'm working on, and push yourself towards vulnerability of, yeah, I don't feel competent at this and I feel really uncomfortable and maybe I experience shame or I just don't like how I function here, and begin sharing that problem with your therapist. So knowing what your outcomes are and being willing to be vulnerable about it can really help. And again, you want to always hold a couple realities in mind. If you feel this very instinctive desire to close over when your therapist explores, don't take off the table that there might be something about your therapist that you're uncomfortable with. For example, I've said many times I can be verbal and somewhat scientific. Some people love that. People with really intense trauma love that because it makes it not about all of these crazy emotions and really intense experiences that feel crazy making. And if you can build a scientific construct for, like, look, this is how human biology works. This is what you're experiencing. It doesn't mean you're crazy. This is a totally normal adaptive response to what was a really intense experience. And so that very often works really well for people with intense developmental trauma because they don't want it to get super emotional. They're already struggling with overwhelms of emotions. But you don't want to take off the table that if you feel yourself closing over very quickly, or when the therapist explores something, don't take off the table. Maybe you're not comfortable with that therapist, or maybe the therapist is too verbal or too scientific or too whatever. For example, I as a client really benefit from nurturing and kindness and a warmth that allows me to emotionally heal. But if you approach me that way first, I'm like, nah, I'm out. The way to access me is through the verbal and the intellect, and then to slowly offer the warmth. And so I have worked with several very skilled therapists who recognize that and will allow me to sort of like intellectually explore and verbalize. And then once things have softened up and opened up, they'll really come with some emotional healing and some presence, which really works for me, right? So they're able to read the room and go, hey, this is how you access things for this guy. But then there are some people who want the warmth and right. So the point again is know what you're working on, have some idea of like where you want to go. Also, well, let me finish the point. And if you find yourself closing over and not sort of sharing and opening and laying out on the table for the therapist, also don't take off the table that maybe this isn't your therapist, right? Maybe this person isn't, for whatever reason, isn't the dynamic, therapists get trained. If 80% of your clients are a certain type of client and you have a certain type of specialization, it slowly shapes you into instinctively using a certain tool set. And when someone comes in for a very different reason, you have to really, as a therapist, be on your game to soften up, let go of your tool set and go, who is this person? Where are they? Or sometimes just you're not their therapist, right? So those things happen. Doesn't mean anything about the therapist, doesn't mean anything about the client. So since I don't feel super clear about all the points I'm making, and maybe I should have thought it through and been a bit more concrete, I'll come to the primary, some of the primary cautions of why someone can come into therapy and why it creates some real boundary issues, and why, even though it might be very well intentioned and all people involved might be well intentioned, why it's so fraught with boundary issues. And therapists know that it's a very, very, not delicate in that you're worried, but it's like it really reduces the chances of a good outcome. And that is people who come into therapy because other people told them they should go to therapy. Now, I'm not talking about someone who's had friends gently urge them, hey man, you really benefit, really help me. I'd love it if you went to therapy. And they're like, yeah, people have been telling me 3 or 4 years. I think they're probably right. You know, I have some real issues. I just never wanted to do it. So in a way, they've taken advice and they've looked at themselves and gone, yeah, I probably do. That's okay. But I'm talking about, and this is the most common one, so there's gender in it, but I don't have an opinion about the gender. It's just for whatever reason, this is how it works, is it tends to be often men who come into therapy because their wives insist that they come into therapy. Now, that's not a bad thing, and that's not, I have no idea who, probably both parties need help, right? So be really careful. I'm not making a statement about the wife as the bad person in the situation or the husband as the bad person in the situation, or both or either or neither one is, right? The husband could be an extremely dysfunctional person who grew up in such a crazy environment that, you know, they've taken this much insanity and they've reduced it by this much. And so they're like, well, you know, I'm doing pretty good. Like this is normal, right? So how they read what's crazy is just totally different. And they've reduced the crazy for them where they're like, hey, I'm doing pretty good. But for other people, it's still really crazy, right? It's really chaotic. Maybe they drink way too much, but because they hold a job and they're decent and ethical, they think, well, yeah, no, I'm fine. And so maybe that wife is right. But this is a statement that I want to make to you. In terms of succeeding in therapy, it's irrelevant whether that wife is right. There's a real codependency in there because 90% of the time what's happening is that wife has been navigating and negotiating with that husband for years, maybe decades, and has gotten nowhere. And you think that that makes that wife a victim, but it doesn't. If he's not hitting her or terrifying her and controlling her, she's not a victim. What that indicates is she's codependent. Her only real outcome is to set serious boundaries with that spouse, set some expectations, and if it doesn't work out, to move on, which is extremely painful. I know I'm saying it in a dismissive way, but, and again, so I'm telling you things that therapists know and that we discuss with one another that people don't want to hear because it's very painful. And we all do the same thing. We don't want to confront these painful situations. And so I'm saying it in sort of a glib way, but I know there's way more pain and evolution involved. But what I'm saying is that's a pretty clear indicator that that wife is codependent. And she's sending that husband to therapy to fix him and for the therapist to align with her. She wants the therapist to align with her and to tell her husband, you do have an alcohol problem. Let's go to work on this. And she wants a therapist to help that husband eliminate that alcohol problem. This is an incredibly fraught situation. If that husband has resisted that wife's gentle, kind attempts to intercede, he has developed an antagonism or an allergy to that message. That wife pushing that husband to go into therapy and making it clear that it's like, you're going to see, you know, the therapist is going to tell you, they're going to help you with this, blah, blah, blah. You just set up that therapist. Even if the therapist is skilled enough not to align with the wife, you just set up that therapist so that when or if they really do recognize that there was a problem and they very gently, respectfully try to help that man recognize his problem, all he hears is my therapist just aligned with my wife who's been nagging me for 5 years about this. And he bails or he shuts down or he might play the game because it keeps his wife happy, but there's no work being done. So codependent wife, you're not helping, right? You go to therapy and talk to a therapist about your own codependency of like, how do you deal with something where my spouse is at a relatively toxic level, and this is very complex, and it causes me a lot of pain and it wears me down, and I still love him. I love him deeply. And add kids, make it even more complicated. Man, you have a big problem to confront. But what you're doing, and it's real, it's not that you're not seeing what you're seeing, you are, but you have a problem as big as he does, and you're shipping him off. But that sets up that therapy to be extremely fraught and very difficult. And you can handle, I've handled it before, if you're super gentle and make sure that when that client comes in, they know that you're aligned with them. But you should know that that's a real caution, and there are real boundary issues there. Therapists know that there are real boundary issues there. Boundaries are being crossed. You should come to therapy because you need therapy. You can gently advise someone to have therapy, but if they do not initiate it and do not believe in it and do not want it and do not understand it for themselves, you know how people end up really allergic to therapy and write it off for 20 or 30 years because someone pushed them and manipulated them into therapy, or parents who are really dysfunctional and create a dysfunctional environment, and then their kid has depression and anxiety, they send the kid to therapy, and then the therapist aligns with the parents, is like, well, we need to work on this, and pathologizes the kid, and the kid, the 12-year-old, like grows up and is like, fuck these assholes. I wasn't the crazy one. My parents were. And then the therapist aligned with them. And well, it's so fraught to push someone else into therapy. It's like pushing someone else into sex. And I don't mean that in a gross way that therapy is like sex, but what I mean is it is that vulnerable. It's that vulnerable and that intimate to decide that you really need to work on yourself and to work with your inner world, with your intimate emotional responses and instinctive responses and biological system and your spiritual presence, like whatever it is, however you want to describe it. It's one of the most personal things on the face of the planet. And you want a therapist who deeply respects that and has really good boundaries. But if you're coercing someone and being like, this is why court mandated therapy tends to be bullshit. The person is just there to check the box and go, I did my thing, so reduce my prison sentence, or let me back to see my kids. Or that doesn't mean that no one in those situations has any of their own motivation. There are people who go, oh man, I got myself into this situation. I really do want it for me. But that tends to be the exception. Most people who are coerced or pushed or argued into therapy, you just sabotage their ability because now they're even more resistant. And now anytime the therapist sort of intercedes and says, hey, well, I do see this thing that maybe you're responsible for, maybe we should work on that, they instantly feel like the therapist aligned with the person who pushed them in, and they're already pissed and instinctively defensive about that, right? So one of the most common things I see are men who come to therapy because their wives coerced them to, okay? Or pushed them, or argued, or suggested, or whatever. That doesn't mean it never works. I've had situations where the wife was really kind and gentle and set it up because it's like, hey, my husband's super, super busy, but he said he's into it if I can set it up for him. And then I worked with a client who was able to get ownership of their own therapy, and they really were just super busy, and that's why they had their wife do it. And they were able to do some work and to get somewhere and get ownership of their therapy and to make it about them. And right, there's no black and white. Anything can work. A bartender can get sober. A bartender can be an alcoholic and get sober and still work in the bar. That can happen. It's not very common. I don't recommend it, but it can totally happen. So someone who's been pushed into therapy by a spouse, if they really meant to do it and they just needed their spouse to remove some roadblocks, yeah, that can work. Or they can discover in therapy ownership of their therapy. But most of the time, it's a real red flag when a spouse is urging, pushing, coercing their spouse into therapy because they don't know how to deal with the issues their spouse has. Especially if they don't understand that that means they have issues and they're making it all about their spouse. Like, yeah, my husband, this and that. I really do love him. He's great, but he had a really bad childhood and I didn't. Like, that's a big caution when I hear that. I didn't, my parents are great, but his situation, if he could really understand how abusive his parents were and how it makes him act, it's like, maybe you're right, but A, it's BS that you don't have issues because if you didn't have issues, you wouldn't have this boundary issue. You wouldn't have this boundary. You would understand, oh, it's on me that I chose this person. And there's something about this person that means that I have issues. The fact that I chose and committed to this person and chose to have children with this person, if I did, I can talk about how my parents are perfect all day long, but it's bullshit. You have issues, or you would not have chosen and committed to that person. And your issues match his issues in some way. But you've adopted the superior position, right? You have issues. You should go to therapy. So that's the first thing. Even if what you're saying is true about your husband or wife, but it's usually the other way around, it's not a great situation with a lot of promise for learning and help. Now, the therapist can very gently have that conversation, and I've had that conversation many times, right? I always insist when a wife or husband calls and says, hey, I'm going to set up therapy for my spouse, I always insist, yeah, I get it, and I empathize. It sounds like there's something really going on there. But to be direct with you, therapy works much better when that person chooses it. So I don't want to charge you anything. I want the spouse to call me. I want to know that they're comfortable with me. I want to know that they understand the work that we do, that they have an intention, right? So you're not hurting the therapist. I'm not saying that this is a problem for therapists. It's just when we see this, we know there are some real issues that are not on the table. And it's way more complicated because the wife or whomever sends the other person is not our client. And so there's a boundary issue if we're like, there's a boundary issue for me to go, let's say I'm talking to the husband and go, hey, by the way, your wife has issues. She shouldn't just be coercing you to come into therapy. Well, that's an issue. It's unethical for me to like leap in and diagnose someone who's not my client. It's unethical for me to sabotage people's relationships, right? If that man is not coming in to work on his relationship with his wife, and I'm telling him, hey, I as a therapist have an issue with the fact, or I think it's an issue for you. So it puts the therapist in this position where it's like, suddenly you're dealing with this dynamic where the wife is in the room, but the wife's not in the room, right? And you have to be ethically, you have to be very careful about even talking about the wife's emotional profile and why it's an issue and trying to help the husband get ownership of his therapy. And very often he really has some serious things to deal with. But one of the serious things to deal with is the fact that he accepts that he's the only problem in the relationship, right? I mean, that's as big an issue as anything. That his spouse has set herself up as the idealized spouse who has no issues, and she set him up as the problem. That's a big problem. And the therapist is going to need to deal with that. In order to deal with it, he's going to have to gently hint at some point and explore with the husband of like, Are you sure your wife doesn't have issues? You know, how is it that we need to fix you, but you didn't think you needed to be fixed? And you didn't come into therapy voluntarily. I hope that you have now are volunteering to do it. I hope it's helpful. If it's not, you should fire me. If it's not helpful, don't waste your money. Like, why are you doing this? Well, we know why, right? So there are situations where spouse A is really struggling with the issues of spouse B. And spouse A recognizes, yes, there are issues, please go to therapy, but it's still an issue. Because the person coming into therapy doesn't have ownership of it, has no idea, has no motivation. Their only motivation is like, I want my spouse to leave me alone and stop complaining. An even more difficult situation is sometimes spouse A sending their spouse to therapy is some level of a personality disorder, and they are the truly toxic person, or they are a narcissist. And I get these situations where the narcissist has idealized themselves. They're perfect. They don't do anything wrong. They understand psychology. They understand emotions, and they've got everything lined out, and their whole marriage is just them suffering through what a piece of crap their husband or wife is. And they send husband or wife, often husband, and then husband is sitting there trying to fix problems that aren't actually his problems, or wife when the roles are reversed. The problem the husband has is that his self-esteem is so trashed from his childhood and then from his marriage to a narcissist that he doesn't understand. His biggest problem is his inability to understand that he's not necessarily the primary problem. His biggest problem is his willingness to accept abuse and condescension and nagging and insults and control from a toxic spouse who sent him to therapy. And I'll tell you where this starts to get a little bit more toxic. Not unmanageable, but it starts to get a little bit more toxic. Another warning signal, another red flag for therapists. When you go to therapy, if you have a really warm, reciprocal relationship with your spouse, and you chose to go to therapy, you're like, honey, you know, you've pointed some things out with me, and I recognize it's really true, and I want to work on this. Like, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to go to therapy. And you go to therapy, and you come home, and your husband or wife is like, well, how was it? And you share, you know what? My therapist said this or that, and we did some eye movements, or I worked on grounding, and I feel a bit better, but I feel pretty triggered about this. And wife is like, well, or husband is like, you know what, honey, I'm really proud of you, and I'm here for you if you want to talk about it. You know, I always notice that you get really nervous before meetings with your boss. Maybe you can mention that to them. You hear the tenor and tone of that. It's supportive. So your therapy is yours, and your spouse is yours, and your life is yours. Therapist doesn't get to have an opinion about whether you discuss your therapy with your spouse. But let me tell you, big red flags. This situation where, again, I'm using a gender, but this gets flipped sometimes, but there is a strong predisposition for this situation to happen where it's a wife sending a husband and the husband coming in. Browbeat husband with a very negative, somewhat narcissistic wife who has a lot of really negative, insulting opinions about that husband. There are many situations where the husband is a mess. So I'm not saying that that isn't true, but I'm talking about this situation where it's a narcissist who's sending their spouse to therapy. This happens in the reverse a lot too, where the husband literally has to go home and report what he did in therapy to the wife. And the wife will get pissed off if he doesn't immediately change. We'll be like, well, what is the therapist working on? I don't understand. Like, I thought you were going to fix X, Y, or Z. And and God forbid, and the husband is just as bad, right? Because if the therapist, say 6 months in, you develop some trust and some boundaries, and you're like, hey, I really do think that you should get ownership of your therapy. Your life is yours, but I think it would be healthier if you didn't discuss everything with your wife, or maybe if you didn't discuss your work with your wife. This is yours. And they go home immediately and are like, my therapist thinks I shouldn't talk to you about what we do because he thinks you're controlling. Okay. This is a person who has no command and no ownership of self. Okay, that's why people come to therapy. But what you did was just pour fuel on the fire. Spouse A is extremely controlling and narcissistic and trying to control both you and your therapist. Doesn't care whether you're emotionally healthy, doesn't give a crap. Is narcissistic. It's just like, well, you annoy me in these ways and I want this fixed. And it's this therapist's job to fix it, and it's your job to go get fixed. And you take the therapist advocating for you, standing up and being an adult and getting ownership, and all you do is go, oh, therapist was aligned with my spouse trying to fix me, but now actually the therapist is aligned with me and my spouse is full of crap. Well, they are full of crap, but your therapist cannot fix your life in that structural way. The therapist cannot defend you against a toxic, abusive spouse. The therapist can help you build the strength and the inner fortitude to recognize what you chose and why, and to make better choices for yourself. But you will have to make the choices for yourself. Unless it's serious domestic violence, in which the therapist has to advise you on an escape plan, and you're probably going to need to call the police, and your husband, you're literally afraid for your life, and your husband has broken your arm before, or your wife has threatened you with a knife before, or it's covert narcissism where they threaten to commit suicide if you don't do what they want. In those situations, therapists have ethically bound to attempt to protect life and even sometimes property. But they don't do it by being a moral authority in your life and telling the husband or the toxic husband or wife they're full of crap. They do it by strengthening you or referring you to the police or to some protecting body, or helping you get to a home or get to a friend or family member's house where you can get out of the toxic environment and start protecting yourself. Therapists are about building you, not about manipulating your life or manipulating people in your life, or even telling people in your life that they're full of crap. And sometimes they are. Sometimes they absolutely are totally full of crap. Sometimes we've married personality disorders, or sometimes a boss or coworker is just a miserable human being. Your therapist cannot rescue you from that. Right? Sometimes, and I do this work a lot and I enjoy it. And it can be healthy to have someone be like, hey, I want to bring my mom or my dad in, or I want to bring my sister in, or I'm like, I know you're my therapist, and it's like, yeah, a marriage and family therapist develops a big skill set and be able to navigate that. But the potential for changing anything is almost nothing, because the therapist has developed no trust with that spouse or that parent. In fact, people don't trust therapists. People who have issues and hurt other people with their issues have been told that they have a problem, but they're highly defended against it. And those kind of people have a little bit of a paranoia about therapists. The therapists are going to blame them, right? You got to be realistic. Maybe the therapist can help you navigate language and help soften the situation up and help provide a little refereeing, maybe a little bit. But if you have a toxic family member, do you think you're going to invite them into therapy and they're going to trust your therapist who's aligned with you And your therapist is going to be like, hey, mom, I really noticed that you're actually fairly angry and antagonistic when you respond to things that your son says to you. People trust therapists. There's sort of like a little bit of imposition of the medical model where they're like, oh, you're the authority. But there's not a lot of leverage that comes with that unless the family decides to do the family work and go, okay, we're going to come into you for a year and we're going to do work as a family. But as a one-off of just navigating, and 8 times out of 10, when the client asks for that, what they're asking for is like, oh, you know how toxic my family member is. Can we bring my family member in and you can tell them because they won't listen to me? They're going to listen to the therapist. Or even if they kind of intend it, if that is so deeply set for them, they're not going to come into one session and be different. They might attempt to talk differently. They might attempt to meet some standard that the therapist sort of sets and helps model and role play for them, right? So to go back to the scenario, it's the situation where someone who is being abused has been coerced to going into therapy because they're being demonized or pathologized as the problem. And once the therapist gently guides them to realization, it's like, you're not the only person with issues here. The spouse who sent you has issues. In fact, their issues might be worse. That's why they're not in therapy. They just sent you. Right? Sometimes the other person is in therapy, whatever. Don't black and white what I'm saying. I'm just indicating situations that make it way less likely that there's success in therapy. So that the person, the client, is like, finally gets the message and believes like, oh yeah, I'm not the only problem here. And suddenly gets angry and is like, they did this, or they blah, blah. Like, you know what? I want to do a session with my wife, or I want to do a session with my husband. A skilled therapist is going to navigate that to not trigger wife or husband, especially if they're toxic and personality disorder. They're going to handle it. So a couple things happen. If the therapist handles them with kid gloves, then the client feels betrayed because they're like, but I thought you were going to tell them the stuff you told me. Hey, the therapist has developed no trust with that person. They're not going to walk in and the therapist just be like, hey man, you are toxic. I mean, you are really abusive. The way you talk is really unacceptable. In couples work, sometimes I do that. After a long time when it's really clear to both members of the couple that I genuinely care for both of them and intend the best for both of them and will align with either one, and occasionally will step in and go, hey, I'm sorry to tell you this, and I hope you know that I align with you sometimes, but I do feel like there's an issue here in how you talk to your wife or how you talk to your husband. I don't know why it is. Maybe they're doing something that I don't see. I don't want to demonize you or make you wrong, but just here in the room, there's an energy that you're approaching your spouse with that's not helping with this dynamic. Can we look at that? Right? So you can do that if you've developed trust. But the idea of just inviting a family member into therapy, yeah, you can work on dialogue a little bit. The therapist can see who your family member is, or at least how they like, but there's significantly lowered chances of success. If you're kind enough and gentle enough with the person who's been brought in, the client feels that you weren't as direct about their issues as you were with the client in one-on-one. Or if you are more direct with the family member who comes in, they don't know you. They just get offended and be like, well, of course, you're my son's therapist. Like, of course, like he just comes in here and talks bad about me. And like, of course you think I'm the bad guy. They might not say that, but right, there will be some defensiveness in there. So to maximize your chances or anybody's chances of truly evolving in therapy, A, If you go to therapy because you decided to go to therapy. If someone advised you and you recognize that it's good advice, great. If someone coerced you into going to therapy, they need therapy as badly as you do. If someone coerced you into going to therapy, they need therapy as badly as you do. Again, come back to maybe you're terribly dysfunctional and had a horrible childhood. The person who married you and committed to you has some level of narcissism. No one marries someone at a vastly different level of emotional functioning. But what often happens is the person who's dysfunctional on the surface will marry someone who hides their dysfunction under a morally superior facade so that they can continue to act like I'm a victim and I'm more emotionally intelligent and my wife or my husband is blah, blah, and they really need help. Bullshit. You would not have committed to that person if you were more emotionally functional and emotionally intelligent than they were. This is a fact as sure as gravity. We all follow an attachment pattern of committing to someone with an equal level of emotional trauma, damage, intelligence, and self-awareness. End of story, amen. Nobody likes to hear it. I don't like to think it about myself. Nobody wants to deal with it. We all want to think somebody else is a problem. They might be the more obvious problem. We do this with people with addictions. I've talked about this before. A whole family just wrapped around this one person with a severe alcohol problem, a severe coke problem, meth problem, opioid problem. They're so obviously destructive. Everybody in society goes, oh, that poor family. Yeah, kids, poor kids. But that spouse is heavily codependent and completely emotionally detached. And if you instantly removed the responsibility of children and instantly removed that alcoholic from their situation, they would not change one bit. They would remain severely emotionally detached and dissociated from themselves. Because they came into that marriage with that severe detachment and codependency of, I need someone to fix because I'm not present to myself at all. I can't deal with my own issues. I'm completely detached from my own emotional state. So I'm going to adopt someone who's completely embroiled and victimized by their emotional state. Their emotional state's totally on the surface. I'm going to spend all my life doing nothing but dealing with theirs as an excuse to never look at mine. There's no such thing as the alcoholic and her husband or the alcoholic and her wife. There's the alcoholic and the person who is as severely codependent and dysfunctional as the alcoholic. Until that person recognizes it and goes, I'm going to set boundaries, I'm going to protect my kids, and I'm going to move on if I have to. Again, caveat. When people are in financial situations where they're trapped, sometimes people get into dysfunctional situations because they were dysfunctional and they were raised in an abusive family and it was normalized. And then they realize 5 years later, but now they got 3 kids, financially overwhelmed. If it's a woman who didn't work because they have a traditional relationship and the husband earns all the money, but he's an alcoholic and she realizes, oh my God, this is dysfunctional, I need out. She really is in a situation that she can't do a lot about, right? She's got 3 kids. She may not have built a skill set, whatever. There are situations that people are trapped. I'm not criticizing those people. I'm not saying people are never trapped. They are. What I'm saying is the uncomfortable truth is not a single one of us commits to, brings our attachment style to a spouse who doesn't match our spouse's level of emotional intelligence. And none of us want to hear it, but it's a fact. You might intellectually be more aware of the patterns, and you might argue about the patterns and be like, blah, blah, blah. But the fact that you would attach to that person and stay with that person, if they're abusive, the fact that you put up with the abuse is your emotional dysfunction. It sucks, but this is a fact. None of us want to see it. We want to believe that we're a victim, but we choose it. It might be for sad reasons. It might be for reasons that we're not responsible for. But once you become aware, and it is your job to become aware, right? So getting ownership of your own therapy, of realizing that most of your therapy should be about you. And if you are working through someone being abusive towards you or toxic or really difficult, the most important question is, why would I have chosen that? And why would I have been willing to put up with it? And how do I learn to navigate this so that I no longer put up with it? And if you're truly trapped, your therapist will help you with that. If you truly are financially trapped, or if that person is dangerous, your therapist is trained or should be trained to help you create a go bag. Leave it by the door. Don't let that person get between you and the door. There are people who, when they get intensely controlling and violent, will like block people's exits. Make sure you have the keys to the car, your car. Make sure you have a place to go. Prep a friend. Say, hey, things are really, really bad and things are way worse than you might have ever thought. And I may need to leave in the middle of the night, and I need to know that there's a place that I can come and knock on a door and go, I need to stay with you, and I need you to not tell anyone where I'm at. A therapist, your therapist should have been, and most likely is trained to help you navigate that. If you're truly in a situation that's dangerous or violent, or you're financially trapped or financially being exploited. Most of us chose someone who matched the level of intelligence, emotional intelligence. And if we're the person who saw the patterns, we'll sit there and act superior, but you would never have chosen that person or put up with it if you were. You're codependent. You like being in a position where you get to be the smart one and you get to tell the other person what a mess they are and they need help and they need to go to therapy. They probably do. So do you. Anyway, that meandered. I hope there's value in it. There's a lot more to be said, but I've got incoming. But again, just things that makes therapy much more successful. Ownership of it. Knowing that you're going in for your work. Knowing what you think your work is and what your outcomes are, what you would like your outcomes to be. Having ownership of it, making it yours, not going because someone coerced you or because someone told you and you're like, well, okay, that's fine, I'll go. You know, get him off my back, get her off my back. Outcomes are not great for that kind of stuff. Boundaries. If you're going home and reporting to your spouse every time you go to therapy because they put you in therapy to fix you because they're irritated, and then they get pissed off and they're pissed off at you and they're pissed off at the therapist. Why isn't he doing this and that? Like, why doesn't he talk to you about blah, blah, blah? Why doesn't she work on X, Y, or Z? That is a toxic spouse. Because even if you are that big of a mess, it is their responsibility to go to therapy and to figure out how to navigate it with you. And if it cannot be navigated, it's their job to leave. Not to control a therapist into fixing that person. There's something really toxic about that. Really dysfunctional about that. So if you're in a situation where you're going, or if you're the person who's like just had it and you're sending your spouse to therapy and you're like, did you talk about X, Y, or Z? Did you tell them that I said this, blah, blah, blah? Man, that is not healthy. You go to therapy, you get a therapist and go, my husband or wife seems incapable of becoming aware of their emotional issues. What do I do here? What do you do here? It's okay for therapists to take suggestions, but if that's a regular thing where the client is having to go home and report what they worked on to their spouse, that is not a healthy situation and generally doesn't work out. So you need ownership. So I guess I'm cooking it. I'm boiling it all down to, if you're going to go to therapy, you need ownership of your therapy. You need to know why. You need to know what you want. You need to know what kind of person you're comfortable with. And you need to know that your therapist cannot rescue you from a dynamic unless it's truly abusive and there's a danger to life and limb, in which case they'll help you navigate and bring in the police, a restraining order, whatever. But it's still not even the therapist rescuing you, right? Therapy is going to be about how do I strengthen me to either realize, oh, I was making this bigger than it needs to be, or this is really toxic and I need to figure out how I'm going to navigate to a healthier, more respectful place for me. It's not going to be the therapist going and beating up your spouse and telling him, well, actually, you sent him to therapy, but you're the one who's full of crap. That doesn't work, never going to work. Therapy's for you, and it's for your work, and it's for how you strengthen you. It is not to make someone else more comfortable with how you are, right? How you are is up to you. Anyway, it's pretty, there's a lot more content there, but like I said, I've got incoming. So glad to see you guys, love you guys, and I will talk to you next time. Take care.
Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.